What's up, Story Geeks? My name is Jay Sherer. His name is Caleb Monroe. How are you today, Caleb?
Doing well.
Good. That's good to hear. We're almost on the weekend, which is phenomenal. On today's Impactful Writing podcast, Caleb and I are joined by Drew Thomas to talk about the movie they wrote together, The Mongolian Connection, which you can watch for free, by the way, on Amazon Prime right now. I want to ask the question of what is it like to write a movie that's available to millions of people? We're going to find out what that is like. You can also support Caleb and Drew by watching The Mongolian Connection. So please go check that out. There's actually a trailer that you can watch in the comments of our YouTube video, and in the comments on Facebook, you can check out the trailer for The Mongolian Connection there. I highly recommend that you check that out. You can support me by checking out my full cast audiobook, Death of a Bounty Hunter, which is available at deathofabountyhunter.com. So let's get into this storytelling that went into The Mongolian Connection, and welcome Drew to the show. Drew, how you doing?
Hi, guys. I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Welcome to the Impactful Writing Podcast and the Story Geeks Network. How is your week going? Has this been a good week? We live in a time where I feel like I need to make sure that everybody is doing okay.
Yeah, everything's a caveat this year, huh? It's like, yeah, okay, good, considering. Exactly. I feel like that's the pat answer. And doing well, thanks. I'm prepping for a test shoot for a new series. It's a cinematography job, not a directing job, but so I've been jumping through a whole ton of hoops dealing with that. But it's worthwhile. If it goes, it'll be a really good series. So yeah,
that's awesome.
Happy to be part of it. So.
Yeah, and it's good to hear that people are back at work in the industry too, because you never know. Some people have still shut down, nothing's back up. So
what I've heard, and I don't know exactly if this is the statistic, but I've heard 75% of the industry is still unemployed. Yeah. So hopefully that changes soon, but that's what I've been hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody wear your masks, stay out of trouble, and we can get everybody back to work. That'd be a good thing.
Exactly.
All right, let's transition into this conversation about The Mongolian Connection. I'm excited about this. I watched the movie last week, came up with a bunch of questions as I was watching, which I've learned to do from hosting the Story Geeks podcast. And so this is just sort of me merging both podcasts together. And Caleb, you're basically a guest this week. You had to take over 100% of the hosting duties for me on the last show. So this week you just get to hang out and be a guest. That sounds like kind of fun. And by the way, I do want to plug the show that I was not a part of that Caleb and Rachel Hemsley did. Definitely go listen to that. They talked about how to become a better writer, and it was a fantastic conversation. If Rachel ever watches this episode, thank you, Rachel, for doing that. I really appreciate it. Great conversation from you guys. But the first question I have for you, Caleb and Drew, and you guys can fight over who wants to answer these questions first. Feel free to just jump in. What made you decide to work together on this project? There are a ton of screenwriters out there wondering how to get involved in projects like The Mongolian Connection. So how did you both meet, and then how did you decide to work together?
I'm going to let Drew go first, just because there was already a full script when Drew and I met. I was joining him to work on something that existed. So I'll let Drew start the story of that.
So I'm not a professional writer, and though there was a draft, as Caleb pointed out, it was actually a second draft. Well, sort of draft 1.5. I know enough to know what I don't know, and where I need help. And I knew that I wanted to roll a professional writer in to help with structure, to help with story, and as Caleb will back me up, and to help with theme. So I simply put the word out there to friends in the industry saying, hey, what great writers do you know? And I got, of course, a bunch of names, and I asked people to send me little samples of their writing. And Caleb's was my favorite of the samples I got. Plus, he had a A+ rating from friends. Caleb is friends with the wife of the cinematographer of the film, and so Caleb and I met at a Mexican restaurant that I drag a lot of my my meetings to there in Hollywood, and over Mexican food and margaritas, we hashed it out.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so this was your first introduction to Caleb, was at a Mexican food restaurant with margaritas after seeing his work.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
That is
very dark. It was such a dark Mexican restaurant that I wasn't sure I would recognize Caleb later. Luckily, we commuted electronically after that, so it worked out somehow. And Caleb had to endure stressed out Drew calling him sometimes at really off hours from Mongolia, asking for last minute tweaks and help and such on scenes and so on.
Oh, totally.
So
which it actually kind of worked out well, because they were usually sleeping at the time of day when I could work on the script. So when they woke up, hopefully I would have something for them.
Totally.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually kind of works out kind of nice. So I want to pick up on a couple things you said there, Drew, because they're really important. And I've learned this primarily in just my other roles, when I've been in leadership at other companies trying to hire people on to work on things. And it's not just, you said this very well, it's not just about your talent. It's also about, are you a responsible person? Do you come with an A rating from your friends? Like, a lot of people will not want to work with you if the experience they have with you is poor. And so that's a really good point, is it's not always just about the talent and the writing, because sometimes there's really talented people, but there's really talented people I know that have burned me that I'm like, well, I'm never going to work with you again because I don't want to deal with this. You know what I mean? It's just, that's part of the process. So that's really good. Caleb, what was it like from your side to be able to meet Drew and to get involved in this project? What was that like?
Yeah, so on my side, it started with Josua Fischer, who is the cinematographer on the film and one of the producers. He is married to a coworker of mine and a good friend, and knew that I was a writer and knew that Drew was looking, and asked if I had any samples. So I gave him two. One was the only feature I had written at that point. I got paid to write it, but I never gave it to the producers because they never signed my deal memo. So it had just been sitting in limbo, but it's like, now I had something to do with it. And then also I think I used I gave him an elementary spec script, and I actually don't know which of those Drew read. But Drew liked it enough for us to meet at El Compadre there. And it was, so I gave Josua the samples, and then I didn't know if I usually assume, well, I'm never going to hear anything again, so then I can just go on with my life. So every time I submit anything anywhere, I'm like, well, that's great. I'm sure it'll be a no, and then I keep going with life. And so then every time there's a yes or a next step, it's like a pleasant surprise. Mm-hmm. And so, but I did do one extra step, and this was after I'd given Josua the samples, before I knew if Drew was even interested. I did my version, I guess, of Drew reading people's samples, and that is that I watched Drew's previous film, and I think Josua let me read the draft as it existed then, and so I'm reading the draft. I'm like, is this a story that I would actually be helpful to? Like, there's some scripts and projects that they're not for me. So reading it to see, can I see myself helping make this better? And then I watched Drew's previous film, Channeling, and I enjoyed it. And it was fun. It had a lot of great ideas, but it also had this intangible thing. I don't know how to describe it, but I just call it growth factor. I could tell that Drew's next film was going to be better. And so on and so forth. Sometimes you see a film and you're like, well, that person I think they've peaked. But I saw Channeling, and it's like, this guy is just getting started. I like this, and I can tell the next one's going to be better, and I can see myself helping get the script there. And so when Drew expressed his interest, I was on board if he would have me.
Very cool. In a recent episode of the show, and this is going to be more of a question for you, Drew, just based on what you guys just told me. Caleb and I talked a lot about how to start a story, and stories always begin because somebody has an idea or gets inspired to tell this story. So where does the Mongolian Connection start from an idea or an inspiration? Like, what kicks off this storytelling journey for you?
Well, it's a good question, Jay. And the Mongolian Connection, its sort of origin story is completely different from my previous two features. Of course, my first feature was a documentary, so that's neither here nor there. But whereas the second feature, it was basically high concept. I had an idea. I teased it out and teased it out and teased it out for a couple of years until it was ready to go, or ready-ish. In this case, I basically had an opportunity to make a movie, a co-production, mostly shot in Mongolia. And that's, of course, a whole other story how that happened. But when I met with the Mongolian producers, which was on a Halloween, I think in 2016, I think it was, for a long meeting at the same restaurant, I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit. When we had that meeting, I expected them to come to me and say, hey, we've got this concept, we've got this outline, we've got this script. Would you like to do this? And indeed, there was a long, Amra, one of the Mongolian producers, as well as the Mongolian lead, he plays the detective Gans. He told me a long story about a film he wanted to make, and I thought the story was strong, and I thought it was going to end with, would you like to do this? Instead, it was like, oh, I'm doing this on my own later. What do you want to do? So it's really ironic because I don't know that this is most people's experience. I sort of doubt it is. But both with channeling and with the Mongolian Connection, if anything, I had more creative license than I knew what to do with. The Mongolian Connection, I started by researching what were some of the challenges of modern day Mongolia. And I really started to tease that out, and I did copious research. I found out that Mongolia it's an enormous country as far as land-wise, but it's tiny population-wise. There are something like 3.2 million people in the entire country, and the country is more than twice the size of Texas. Wow. So it's a large country sandwiched between China and Russia that has a very small population, yet it is a source country for human trafficking, for both workers, physical labor, miners, so on, but also sex traffic. And so a lot of young women in Mongolia, unfortunately, have been lured with false promises, and they've been lured to places like Macau and forced into the sex trade. And so this is a very real problem. I will say for anyone, and I hope some of the viewers will check out the film. Though the film itself has a mixed tone, it's often sort of humorous and comedic. I will say that everything that Caleb and I discuss in the story, the model of the crime syndicate in the story is 100% based on reality. So much so that I had to simplify some things just so it wasn't too much of a mishmash of, wait, what does this mafia do again? But so I started doing a ton of research. I read a book called God in the Brothel, which was it's nonfiction, written by a guy who traveled the world infiltrating the sex trade and trying to bring it down, working with local authorities. And so I kept writing. I was reading books written, pulpy novels written that take place in Ulaanbaatar, the capital. And I wrote a long outline and started writing scenes and so on. And then I went and did a development trip. Yosua, the cinematographer and producer on the film, he and I traveled to Mongolia, met with the Mongolian producers, traveled the country, stayed overnight in a semi-legal gold mine in a yurt. And of course, going there changed everything. My first night there, I was jet lagged and couldn't sleep. And for a number of reasons, I'm sorry to go on this tangent, but my first night in Mongolia, we had dinner with the Mongolian producers, Amra and his wife Uran. And Amra looked me in the face, and we started talking about the story as written so far. And he explained to me that not only was the story far too similar to another film that he had acted in that was made in Mongolia, completely produced and created in Mongolia, but that he hated that film, and the film was not a success. So it was a sore point for him. So, at this point, I'm on the other side of the world, totally jet lagged and exhausted. And I've been dropped back off at where the home we were staying in, and thinking, well, that's it. This is just sort of dissolved into the ether. And I went to bed and could not sleep. I called my girlfriend at 1 or 2 in the morning, Mongolia time, and was freaking out. And she talked me down and said, she's smiling in the background. She talked me down and said, hey, just try to get some sleep, take a Benadryl if you have to, and this will look different in the morning. Well, I slept a couple hours, got up, and I had watched with Yosua on the plane a couple American Westerns, and really, really loved one of them in particular, and which was 3:10 to Yuma, the original, which I watched on Criterion. And again, I watched a series of them, and Yosua and I talked about them. We watched a lot of noir, particularly Japanese film noir, specifically a film called A Cult Is My Passport. And I took the story, the original story, and modified it. Not dramatically, but enough so that it was quite different from the film that Amra had told me about the night before. And Yosu and I got up at 5 in the morning local time and wrote down a new outline, put it all onto index cards, laid it out in front of us, took photos of it. And later that morning, we got picked up to travel through the Mongolian countryside. And the whole time we were driving for hours and hours across the roughest roads in the world, we talked story, and it developed from there and evolved from there. And then when I got back, wrote a first draft, and then soon thereafter, cried for help and got Caleb.
That's awesome. That's such a good story.
And a rambling story. I apologize for that.
No. That's really fantastic. So, what are some of the core elements that you actually shifted in that second draft, if you will, as you had that sleepless night where you got a little bit of sleep and then came back to what were some of the big changes that you made there?
Well, so I'm going to have to think back. I think I blocked it out to what the original outline was like. The original outline was probably much more noirish and darker. And it did deal with this human trafficking, but it also dealt with, there's a type of miner. Miner is in digs for precious gems. There's a type of miner in Mongolia that are called ninjas. And they're called ninjas because of the Ninja Turtles, because they're known for wearing big bowls on their back, like a turtle shell, and they use those bowls to pan for gold and other things. It's a long history that I won't bore the audience with, but Mongolia has traditionally and continues to be sort of taken advantage of by hi guys, my cat is crawling onto.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's the cat's rump. These miners, these ninjas, quote unquote, are independent and illegal miners trying to sort of hack out a living on the Mongolian steppe, oftentimes digging places where they shouldn't be digging, and unfortunately, you've got cows and horses and children that end up falling into these holes. And so it's sort of a problem. It's a complex issue. As I say, Mongolia has been exploited from both sides, really. And still, something like 20% of Mongolia's land belongs to foreign interests, mining and other mineral interests. So I took it from being, I think the original story was much more about ninja miners, and talked about them a whole lot more. And I think sort of put them maybe on a bit more of a pedestal than they deserve, given their, in some cases, shady. It's complicated and it's tough, and I don't want to throw a group of people under the bus under any means. But it's, let's put it this way: their activities are really controversial in the country. So I just took it a very different direction, though it was still structured in some ways like 60s and 70s Asian gangster films. There was so much about Mongolia that reminded me of the American West, turn of the century American West. So I did structure it more like a Western. And it became a lot more about an American who is sent to Mongolia, and how he teams up with a local Mongolian cop. I should say also, for what it's worth, that Walter Hill films of the 1980s in particular were a big influence on me. Films like 48 Hours was, the buddy cop sort of structure. So it changed pretty dramatically in structure and in character, and I think 100% for the better. I can't tell you how much better I felt after not sleeping that whole night and instead working on story, and at least getting it sort of to a rough place where I could re-pitch it to the Mongolian producers and have them smile and say, "Yeah, that's a better direction."
So, how cool!
Yeah.
How cool! That's a great story.
Thank you.
So let me transition into this, because you brought this up, and I think this is really important, because I think that it is definitely guiding your story. This is what I love about talking to storytellers, by the way, is that you're collecting all of this data, and a lot of this data is very emotional data, because you're seeing these problems with the world. Caleb and I talk about this all the time, and stories are about, like, how do we solve these problems that exist in the world? And so one of the things we do on this podcast is that we facilitate discussions in order to showcase how these things are impactful to humans and how stories are really truly impactful to humans. So I'm actually going to start with Caleb first on this, and then I'll circle back to you, Drew, because I'm wondering about the difference between someone who's actually been there doing the research versus somebody who's brought in later. But you're dealing with human trafficking, which you've talked about. You're dealing with substance abuse, which I thought was really interesting, because the lead character from the U.S. actually has a problem with prescription medication, which is a huge problem in the U.S. And I haven't actually seen a ton of films about that kind of deal with that. Plus, you talked about the corruption, the internal corruption in both the local law enforcement, but also the influence of this of the Russian mafia, I guess you'd call them. So Caleb, I'll start with you. And obviously Drew has a lot of this stuff that he actually saw first person, but as you are brought into this, how do you make sure that you are covering, especially in an action movie, you're covering some of the realistic nature of what's going on?
Yeah, well, one great big advantage I had is that Drew is a very thorough researcher. And so when I joined the project, he had a lot of facts and information about what's happening in that part of the world, even what's happening in parts of the U.S. that some of the scenes we went back and forth on what state they were going to be set in. And he talked to an FBI agent. He read books. He went to Mongolia. So there was a ton of research. There was a ton of information that I could draw from. And it was a lot of it was in the script. And if it wasn't in the script, Drew and I would talk, and he could just tell me what was going on in those sort of circumstances in the world. So I was kind of working post research in that these facts were in the story. that there was going to be trafficking, there was going to be some prescription pill abuse. And so my thoughts originally were more about like, okay, well, how do we make these dynamics feel real? Like let's keep all the facts in mind, but then how do we make that feel real to the audience? And do we have to bend any of the facts for that? Or you know what I mean? Like how much of those do we want to use to make it a real experience for the viewer versus sort of a documentary, you know? And so I remember early on, we added a scene that was just Wade at home alone. And it was obvious that he had been left by his girlfriend. And, but that just really quickly added a whole big dimension to when you see him using pills. And in fact, I think at that point, that might've been the first scene we see him using pills in, but you see this loneliness and this sort of half-life that he's living. And so things like that, where it's like, I was thinking like, okay, how do we make it feel real to the audience? And I think that's a lot of the conversations Drew and I ended up having. But you know, it's also really blurry because there was a lot of conversations and there's a lot of drafts on things. So Drew can correct me on anything. Yeah, Drew, what about you?
Well, that's 100% correct. And Jay, I should say that you know, for me, in a way, I needed a storyteller like Caleb to rein me in. You know, when he and I first met, you know, we really talked about emotional truth. We talked about theme. And so, you know, what Caleb and I would do is we would say, okay, well, you know, this is what this character Wade is turning out to be. But, you know, all the action scenes in the world, all the good choreography, slow-mo, bullet hits, all that stuff, no one's going to give a rip about that if they don't have anything invested in the characters. And so, you know, my hope is that we wanted to both entertain the audience. We wanted the audience to sense that there was thought and emotional truth underneath the story. And that it wasn't just sort of tacked on. You know, I think about the Fast and Furious movies, some of which I like, but they always seem to try to find some sort of log line / thematic presence to the film that never rings as honest to me. And so, you know, I leaned on Caleb for a lot of things. You know, even after the film was already shooting or about to start shooting, and I was doing revisions over there, I would call Caleb and say, how do we do this? Like, how do we get this character from here to here? What makes sense? And so, you know, I leaned on Caleb's experience as a storyteller really just to help me figure out and oftentimes simplify the way we were telling stories while keeping, hopefully, an emotional center to the story. Now, and I know we'll touch on this later, but a lot of the work that Caleb and I did, well, not a lot of it, but some of it, are scenes that for running time ended up having to get cut. There was in an earlier cut, exactly to the page, or true to the page, a scene with Wade at home getting ready. His girlfriend has clearly left him, and we show that. And you know, Caleb found these clever details of ways just to say, okay, this is a guy who was living with a woman who is now not there. He still has his dog, who he needs his now ex-girlfriend to look after while he's on the other side of the world. Which, you know, these details suggested that our character was alone. Oh, and there was a long car ride early in the film, and a good portion of that is still in the film, where another character, Troy, another police detective asks, or FBI detective asks Wade about his status with his girlfriend. So, you know, Caleb was really instrumental in helping me simplify, helping me lose extraneous detail that didn't need to be there, streamline the story, and focus on moving the story forward while holding on to emotional truth. Does that sound right, Caleb? Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, for sure. And I should say, because I've talked on this podcast before about sort of how I recommend people don't necessarily work in order. So like that car ride scene was actually the last scene of the film written.
Yeah, true.
And it was after principal photography was over in Mongolia. And but because Drew and I knew the story backwards and forward, we could now write the scene that was going to be near the beginning that would have all of this DNA for things that we knew were later, that we actually knew had gotten shot and all of that sort of thing. So that was a big advantage to writing it with the director, is sort of having knowing exactly what's been shot and what hasn't and how things changed. And then so when you're doing things out of order like that, you're able to make it all tie together.
I love that. I love the fact that you guys can rely on one another to kind of keep getting back to that original vision. Drew, you mentioned Fast and Furious, and I think that the same rule applies with John Wick, because I don't think the first John Wick really works as well if the thugs don't show up to his house and kill his dog, right? Like the whole thing is kind of like, it just emotionally falls apart because you're like, well, John Wick is just another monster in a sea of monsters, right?
True.
But when that happens, it's kind of catalyzes the whole thing. So yeah, I think that's really true. So I'm really impressed that you guys could rely on each other in that way, and that you've got the cross global changes going back and forth. That's really impressive. I like that a lot. I want you guys to walk me through one of the scenes, and I'm going to set it up for the listeners. It's my favorite scene in the film. It is the opening scene, and so for those who haven't seen it yet, by the way, if you for whatever reason, if you're not going to watch the whole movie, which you should absolutely 100% go watch this first scene. It's really phenomenal. So there's this local sting operation in Mongolia that's unfolding, where they're trying to get basically what I would call a regional crime boss to say something incriminating into a wire. And so these two guys are meeting at a restaurant. It's all set up, and all the law enforcement is there. And all of the restaurant staff are actually law enforcement that are posing as restaurant staff. It's this really fantastic scene, and I'm not gonna lead the witnesses here because I have my own answers to this, but I would love to hear your answers. What was the inspiration for that scene? And then walk me through the writing, directing, and editing of that particular scene, that first opening scene.
I'm going to go first just because I'm going to set Drew up for this. Because of all the scenes that were in that draft that existed when I came on, this is the one that remained the least untouched. Drew, obviously, from the very beginning, he saw it. It was real to him. You could see the shots in his mind on the page. And so other than sort of just tweaking a few details to match things that had changed in the rest of the script, and I think maybe changing some formatting stuff because we were working in a slightly different format, really this scene was just left as it was. So I'm just saying that as a setup because I know Drew put a lot of thought into that scene. But one fun fact is that I think in half the drafts we did, this was the first scene. And in half the drafts we did, it was the second scene, and the US scene was first. I think every time we did a draft, we switched those two. And
that's right. I forgot that.
And even when we shot them, we weren't entirely sure which one was going to get edited in as first or second. Just if the scene works, it works. And so you actually have those options. Okay, I'll let Drew take it away as far as.
It's funny, Jay, and I'm really, really tempted to ask you to tell us what you think the influence was. I have a hunch I know what you're going to say, but Caleb may not remember this. But okay, so when I write, because I'm really aware that I'm not a professional writer, when I write, I try to force myself to have the discipline to pay attention to rules that I have learned over my time as a writer. And one of them is, I forget who said it, but, get rid of all the good stuff and what you have left is story. Was that Mark Twain? I don't know who said that, but there's this idea that like Yeah, don't
50-50 shot attributing any quote to Mark Twain.
it's a safe way to go. Twain or Freud? I mean, yeah. So there's this idea that like don't worry about doing cool stuff. You know, when I do a little teaching, and when I teach and I talk about shots, how to build a story visually, how to design shots and put them into a sequence in the way that will tell the story in the most satisfying way, right? Well, when I teach that, I really talk about every shot. You should be able to justify every shot. You should be able to say why the dolly is going from left to right versus right to left, or pushing in. There needs to be a good reason, and I think this is what differentiates good filmmakers from less good filmmakers, because I think with less good filmmakers, you see a shot and that's a cool shot, but does it really engage the audience? Does it move us through the scene? Does it advance the story in the way that it should? So I try to have discipline that I know I don't have, for instance. So I think to myself, okay, well, this opening scene, or like Caleb said, this first scene in Mongolia, does it do everything it's supposed to do for the story, or are we retrofitting the story to make this scene work? And I had this question with Caleb, and he talked me down. He said, no, this is doing what it needs to do. Yes, it's cool, but it's doing what it needs to do, so leave it alone. So kudos to Caleb on that one. As far as influence, I think that, and somebody's pointed out to me before that it reminded them strongly of a scene in the film Blowout, the Brian De Palma film, which is really interesting because Brian De Palma is a huge influence on me. That was not why the scene came to me in the way it did. I was driving when the scene came to me, and I was actually in another state. I was out of town on a freelance job, and the scene came to me in that way. It partially came to me because the scene takes place in a hot pot restaurant, a restaurant where all the customers have a pot of bubbling oil and water at their table, very hot, and you dip meats and vegetables into it. If you haven't tried it, it's really fun. There's probably places around to do it, at least here in California. And the last meal, real meal that I had in Mongolia was at a hot pot restaurant. It was right after successfully pitching the very early draft of the new story, or at least the outline. We had to pitch it to local investors, and that pitch had gone successfully, even though I was pitching in English to a table full of people who did not speak English. So thinking about that restaurant, I mean, I was sort of obsessed with how potentially dangerous having multiple flames and boiling oil and stuff at a small table could be. I would say that structurally, the influence on that scene is Brian De Palma in general, not a specific scene, plus Hitchcock. And I don't mean to say that my work is on the level of either of those filmmakers, but they were an influence on this scene at least.
Yeah, that's phenomenal.
And I just want to point out one thing that I don't think writers think about enough. So I'm going to bring it up here because this is something that Drew is really strong at, and that is the geography of a scene. Actually knowing where everyone is in relation to each other in the room. Drew has a very strong skill set for that as a director, and you can see that coming, in the influences he talks about, Hitchcock and De Palma. You watch any of those scenes, you always know where everyone is in relationship to one another in a room. And Drew created that same knowledge, that same geographical revelation in the hot pot scene. But as writers, you also, if you're not co-writing it with the director, you still need to know that geography. You need to know that the scene works, that people can cover that distance in that amount of time and all of that sort of stuff. So scene geography doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's one of Drew's strengths. And as we wrote, and I realized based on the questions he asked or the things that he wrote into the script that he was very strong at geography, I actually worried less about it. And I started focusing more on just what was happening in the scene and knowing like the later scenes I wrote, it was just much more sort of a flow of just what people were doing, knowing that it would look right in a room when Drew was directing it.
Yeah, that's so let me tell you about why I loved it. And Caleb shared the script with me, so I got a chance to actually read the script as well.
Cool.
And I love that scene in the script. And I'll tell you before I tell you where I think where I saw influences in it. Not because you were influenced by what I'm going to say, but because I think that it is excellent in those other examples, and it is excellent here as well. And that is, let me just start by saying, I think a lot of, especially when you take a script from a writer and you give it to a director, I think that there is this thing that happens, and you guys can tell me if this is true because you guys are more experienced in this than I am. But there's this thing that happens sometimes, I think, where the director, to your point, Drew, wants to get to the cool thing. And Caleb and I talked about this on a recent episode where we talked about a singer who always was concentrated on the high note, and all of her senior level singers were like, hey, you gotta build to the high note. It's not just about the high note. You gotta build to that high note. And so I think a lot of directors, like, they just want to get to that high note or get to that amazing part of the scene. And a lot of writers can do that too. But I think a lot of writers, they start to structure everything so that it's just like, no, you don't understand. It's the suspense before the thing happens that is going to sell the thing that happens, right?
100%.
And that is why I love that scene, because we know the whole time. I think we have a good indication the whole time that it's going to completely go to shit, right? Like it is not going to work out well for this team in this space. And the fact that we know that heightens our tension. And the fact the way that you do this is you bring in the older gentleman, and there's an older gentleman that walks into the scene. He has a little radio with him, and there's these little beats where you're like, oh, this is getting worse every second. The regional crime boss, right? Who walks in to come meet with this guy. You can tell he's growing increasingly suspicious. His goons are getting increasingly suspicious with what's going on. And all of that, to me, I'm going to compare it to, and this is a very controversial person to compare it to, so I apologize if this is offensive to you in any way, but I'm going to compare it to a couple of Tarantino's scenes, specifically in Inglourious Bastards, where Tarantino does this thing where he will sometimes draw out scenes, and you'll go like, oh, there was no point to that. It was just a drawn out scene for no reason. But one of the things he does excellently, in my opinion, is he will draw out a scene when you're like, anyone else filming this scene, it would have already been boring. But because there are people hiding underneath the house, and because the Nazis are sitting at a table with someone else, it is not boring. It is entirely suspenseful. And the whole time you're just thinking to yourself, when is this going to go to pieces? And I really felt like that scene captured that emotion and captured that. So as an audience member, I was very drawn into that, from the script to the screen the whole way through. So just kudos from me. Not that it's worth anything, but I thought that was really, really phenomenal. So, and how does that sit with you? It seems like all of that was very intentional. And how did you go about that in your head, and then making sure you got it on screen too?
Well, so as much of the film as I had time for was storyboarded. Obviously, anytime you're doing stuff that puts an actor or a stuntman at physical risk, you need to know exactly where the camera's going to be, exactly how much risk you need to put this person through, and know more. And knowing your shot exactly means that you can say with assurance that I'm not asking this person to ride through 6 plates of glass on a motorcycle when in the cut he's only going to go through 1. But I'm a copious storyboarder anyways. So Yozu and I were sitting in cafes in Mongolia, just drawing and talking this through. But like Caleb said, I feel very strongly that with any scene of suspense or action, any scene that you're trying to build tension in, you need to know the geography of the space. When I teach, I talk about, what if you're watching a basketball game? And forgive me if any audience members aren't familiar with this, but there's this idea of the 180-degree line, right? It's a line that goes through the center of your scene, particularly between the noses of the two main, the protagonist and antagonist in a scene. So you would draw a line as they're facing each other between their noses or horizontally through the entire set. And unless you want to disorient the audience, which maybe some people want to do in certain scenes, I could see why. But in this case, the last thing you want to do is not know which direction a punch or a bullet is going. So because otherwise if you betray this rule, you risk sapping all the energy and jeopardy out of a scene. And I liken it to, if you're watching a basketball game, most of the time, and 95% of the time, the cameras are all going to be on one side of that court. Never to cross it. Or if a camera does cross it, it's still facing the same direction. It's just on the other side of the line, pointed the same direction. It's just moved the line a little bit. So in the hot pot restaurant, we had scouted the location. I had sort of drawn a rough overhead diagram of the room. And we cheated a lot of space. For instance, the alleyway that the film opens in is in a completely different part of town than the kitchen that the character that Gans walks into. But aside from that, there was an imaginary line going through the center of that restaurant, and the camera never faced back across that 180-degree line in the wrong direction. If in a sporting event you all of a sudden took your cameras, had half on one side and half facing back across from the other side of the stadium, you risk cutting two shots together where the two opposing teams are running the same direction. So as opposed to coming at each other in competition, they're now running the same direction, which obviously would really disorient, confuse, and pull the audience right out of watching it. So I knew I wanted this moment that builds tension. I didn't recall having seen something like this before. There was this line that Caleb and I put in. I don't know who put it in, but one of us put it in to that scene in one of the rewrites where the local sort of mob enforcer, Tenzin is the character's name, old man walks in carrying a radio, which is something I witnessed a lot of older people walking around, particularly men, with radios worn around their necks in Mongolia on a rope. And that caught my eye and said, oh, that's interesting. And I actually saw somebody like this right outside of a restaurant we were going to there. And so I thought, okay, well, what if this guy comes in and he's playing this song, and yes, the mob enforcer, as the scene builds, starts to figure out that something's really amiss, and he's pretty smart, he's pretty savvy, and even his thugs around him are getting increasingly uncomfortable, as you said. But I think at a certain point he would start to toy. He's so confident and so cocky that he's going to walk out of that situation, that at a certain point he's going to toy with this guy who is betraying him. And I thought, okay, so what if? Oh, and again, another thing that Caleb and I did with this character, which made me really love it, and unfortunately some of this ended up on the cutting room floor. But this character, even though he's a hardened criminal and probably a sociopath, is a music lover. So he actually really likes the song that's being played on the radio. And when at a certain point, again, this is not in the final scene. It's a minor detail. It doesn't really hurt the scene. But the police informant yells at the old man to turn his radio off because he knows that it's causing problems and that it could ruin everything they're doing. Well, the mob enforcer, Tenzin, slams his hand on the table and screams, "Leave him alone. Let the song play. I like the song." Partially because he likes the song, and partially because the song is helping him figure out what he knows, he's increasingly knows is amiss in the scene.
That's cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting just to watch the evolution of components in a story. So I'll just give you just an example. So like he was saying, this character Tenzin was a music lover, and so originally there was a thread that we wrote where the song that he heard on that radio, he got stuck in his head. And so in future scenes, like as he was killing people, he was humming that song to himself because it had gotten stuck in his head. And then
Caleb, I love that detail. That was such a that was you. That was a really clever idea.
But later that led to we chose for him to be holding Hulan somewhere where they could do karaoke because he wanted her to sing the song that was stuck in his head. And now all of that story thread didn't make it in, but I think you end up with this scene where she's singing karaoke, and then the actor playing Tenzin, just listening to her play karaoke, just gave such an amazing performance, saying nothing, that the scene ended up being very different than when we were thinking when it was like when we were on this thread of it being stuck in his head. But it just made it a powerful scene, and so it ended up being in a karaoke spot because of something that didn't survive the full cut of the film, but it ends up being a powerful scene because of what the actor brought to that moment. So there's so many moving parts that make something work or not work,
Jay, originally the song in the film, and I'm actually very happy with the song we ended up with. Originally, the song in the film, and in the early cuts, the cuts that Caleb was coming to watch in the edit bay and such, was "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore." And so you had a scene where lots of, again, I don't want to give too much away, but you had a scene where lots of characters are dying to the crescendo of "The sun ain't gonna shine anymore, the moon ain't gonna rise in the sky." And again, I'm very happy I ended up having to do a deep dive for a song we could actually afford to clear, but and I'm very happy with that song. But yeah, that song ended up playing a very important part in the script. You might remember it from the draft you read, Jay. But yeah, so
yeah, that's very cool. And actually, you guys are doing the perfect segue for my next question because the next question is all about how these things change from the moment that you say we're finished with the script to the moment you say you're finished with the film. That's a very different thing, right? It's not the same thing. And so I'm interested in that because there's quite a few things in the script. One of the things I was trying to do as I was watching the film is I was actually trying to read the script at the same time I was watching the film just to see what kind of translated to the screen and how that worked. And one of the things I realized is that there were several things that changed what I would call pretty significantly by the time there was a finished product on Amazon. And so I'm just wondering, I have this question worded to ask Caleb first how he felt about those changes, but I actually think I'm going to reverse it. And I'm going to say, so we'll start with you, Drew. How do you make some of those changes that are certainly influencing, like if I may, you can tell me if I'm completely off base here, but it almost feels in some ways like there was some emphasis taken off the Gans character, and there was some emphasis put on the Sarek character, right? Like the Sarek character almost in the end becomes sort of like a cool anti-hero in some ways.
Correct.
That's almost like not in the script, right? That in the script he kind of feels like he's still a bad guy by the end of it. So just talk me through some of those things. There was the key moment. I'm forgetting her name, so pardon my ignorance of her name, but where she plays a really pivotal role near the end, which is sort of removed in the final take. So talk to me about how some of those changes were made and why they were made.
Well, it's unfortunately it's a really mundane answer to a very astute question. Running time. We had a theatrical release in Central Asia, and we had to get it to 90 minutes. I think in the end, we did a 90-minute cut, and then I went back in and added some stuff back that I was not happy with the 90-minute cut. A good portion of that was done not by me. So I went back in with our editor and repaired a bunch of stuff, and I think it ended up at around 95, 97 minutes, something like that. 97 with titles. I'm very happy with where the film is at. And frankly, I mean, you guys know this is always going to happen. Yeah. There's always going to be stuff that Caleb and I, as the writers of this and the creators of this, that we love. There is scenes that the editor is still upset that aren't in the film. And he will remind me every time we talk about it. Whereas again, I'm very, very happy with where the film's at now, and it is a great representation of what we were trying to do creatively. Sometime down the road, perhaps there will be a longer edit, and some of those things will end up back in. You're very right to point out that Sarek, and this was phone conversations and email conversations that Caleb and I were having when I was in country, when I was in Mongolia. But it was important that Sarek not be a monster. Now, it doesn't come across in the film. In the film, it does seem like, okay, this guy is involved in human trafficking, and that sucks. But yes, maybe he has a tiny moment of redemption. But there was talk about establishing somehow, without just saying it, because you always want to show, not tell, right? That actually Sarek was in the States, not because he had trafficked those women there, but he was in the States because he was coming to rescue Hulan. And that they had fallen in love. Yes, she was trafficked. Yes, that's how they met. But he actually was more honorable and not working on that side of the business. And there's hints at that. When Caleb and I wrote and rewrote the car scene in Texas, we hint at the FBI agent, Troy says to him, there seems to be a beef between this guy, Sarek, and this other guy who's running this brothel. And we see what happens to that other guy. So there was and the way Sarek behaves when he's confronted by the American FBI agent, who's now undercover, pretending to be just a local sleaze trying to run prostitutes through the back door of his hotel casino, which again was based exactly on real events. Not only real events that happened, but real events that happened in Texas. Not in East Texas, but there was a hotel and a hotel casino that was running that exact human sex trafficking operation through their back doors. Not terribly far from where we filmed our scenes in Texas. So again, all that stuff is based on truth. But so it was a challenge because, I'm sorry, you don't get a lot of redemption if you're a human sex trafficker. Right. Nor do you deserve it. So another thing that happened in the film, and this actually, I know that Caleb and I discussed it as shooting went forward, but this is something that the Mongolian producer and lead actor, Amra, really stressed to me. He said, look, I want there to be a moment where Sarek is asking to fight. This is a scene that Caleb and I wrote where Sarek is in a train with these others, and they're about to be beset upon by tons of villains. And we've already established that Sarek knows how to fight, but he's in handcuffs, and he says, give me a weapon. I can fight. You guys are beat up and exhausted. Let me fight. I want to fight these guys now. Let me do it. And Amra, or Gans, the character, turns to him and says, no, we'll fight. You're going to testify, and you're going to go to jail. So even though we established this character as having some good qualities, and certainly he's got agency, and certainly he's powerful and charismatic and good looking and all that stuff, but in the end, and Caleb actually, I'm just remembering now, this whole scene we wrote on the courthouse steps that was never shot, but I don't think it made it into the final draft of the script. But also leaned into this idea that okay, we're going to make the audience like you in ways, but you're not going to be forgiven for monstrous things that you've taken part in. And so it's a small line, but it actually on set gave me chills, where the Mongolian detective says, no, like no matter what, no matter how this thing shakes out, you're going down for what you've done.
That's really cool. Yeah, it's really, really cool. And Caleb, as you watch how these things change, because you're not on the ground, you can't always see like how these things are changing and how they're moving, and you're obviously supplying stuff from across the other side of the world as you can. What is your reaction to the change in story, and what advice do you give to writers who work on these things who then see the changes occur? Like what does that feel like? What does that look like? What do you recommend?
Well, I'll talk about it in a couple ways, but first I'll say that what Drew was just saying, this character of Sarek and this line between sort of evil and being willing to watch him for an hour and a half. If he's too evil, people are just like, I don't care, shoot him in the head, let's get this over with.
Right.
But the story, he needed to be kept alive to testify, so the audience needed to like him enough that they wanted him to stay alive, at least to testify, if for no other reason. And so he was the most discussed character, I think, in all the time that Drew and I worked, and the least finalized going all the way up to the end when things were being shot, as we tried to find what is that balance, like where is that line. And I'll leave it up to the audience whether or not we found it. I will also say that a lot of the final characterization of Sarek came down to the actor Sanjar, and things that he was strong at portraying, and the way things he could communicate without speaking, and the fact that he could be charming and scary. A lot of that, the subtlety that comes with a character like that, ends up resting on the shoulders of the actor, and Sanjar was a great actor, and so that actually gave us a lot more options in the shooting of the scenes than we necessarily had in the writing of the scenes, if that makes any sense. But yeah, so big picture, when you come to a script that already exists in some form, there's a different mindset. You're not here to execute your vision or a vision. You're here to serve this project. If this is a project that you take on, you know that it is something that exists, and that your goal is to make it better. So that's a different mindset than if you're just starting something from scratch and you don't know if it's going to get made or any of that sort of stuff. To come on to something that is going to get made, it's in the middle of being cooked, and you're there to serve it. You want it to come out as the best pastry possible, right? So part of the mindset too, and again, we had a little more freedom on this because Drew was directing it, is there's levels of scenes, or at least the way I think of it. So on one end, you have the if scenes, like if everything works perfectly and we can get someone to give us a train and we can get, you know what I mean? Then we want to do this if version of the scene. But we're also understand we're probably going to have to do a smaller version of that scene. So we would always start by writing the if versions of the scene. I think there was probably 3 or 4 versions of the final train scene, and then even the production realities in real life, still it ended up needing to be different than it had been in all the different versions we'd written of that train scene in the script. But that's okay. It was an if scene from the beginning, because a train is a large set piece, and just the realities of what you can do with a train safely in another country, you really kind of find out when you get there. And so that was an if scene. There was like a vision sequence. That was an if scene. There was a scene where they ride horses as part of a battle scene. That again was an if scene. There's more horses than people in Mongolia. There's a lot of horses.
True. Yep.
But whether you can make that work safely on a set and any of that sort of stuff. So we wrote those knowing that those were if, and then we also had more realistic versions of each of those. But then also, because it's being translated, this added a whole other dimension where we were writing in English things that we knew were going to be translated into Russian and Mongolian. And so we knew that there was going to be idiomatic changes to any dialogue, because at the end of the day, it was like, well, a Mongolian wouldn't say it that way. They wouldn't, you know what I mean? They would say this. And so there was a lot of that sort of thing. And again, that's a very living type of change that's happening on set. It's happening with the translators, with the actors, and with Drew. But what was beautiful about it was that, my co-writer was there the whole time. So any changes that were being made, like there was a writer there. And so I wasn't really worried, I knew that things were going to look different in a lot of ways when it came back to when I got to see it. But I also wasn't really worried, because when you trust your partner, then you know that whatever circumstances come up, that he's going to do the best thing for the story, probably going to make the same decisions that you would have made if you were in that situation. And so you can just, you can let that go. And I actually learned a very important lesson when we finally saw the 90-minute cut, because like Drew said, the very first cut, I don't know if this was a first cut release, but it was just sort of like the first cut, of the whole thing edited together. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes. And, like he said, final version, 90 minutes. So there was 40 minutes of scenes and stuff that were in my head because I had seen them and because I had written them, but they were not in the film. And I had ambivalent feelings about that. This was the first film I ever had made. But then last November, we did a screening here in Los Angeles. And it really taught me something, because I was sitting there and there's like all these little moments in the story where, as a writer, I'm like, I'm not sure if the audience is going to get that, because the scene that really explains it isn't in there anymore. This is how you're thinking. But watching the 90-minute version with an audience and just hearing them gasp and laugh, and they were never confused, it made me realize that those missing 40 minutes only exist in my head, not in the audience's head. You know what I mean? The audience isn't watching it and missing all that stuff. I'm only missing it because I knew it was there, but the story worked fine, without it. So that was also an interesting lesson to learn. Yeah.
And it's a very good lesson about how the human brain works too, right? Because the human brain will fill in spaces. And if it does fill in the spaces the way that you intended them to be filled in, then maybe you didn't need those scenes at all, right? So it's a very, very interesting concept. I love it. I also love the fact that you guys, I'm just going to pick up on this because I have not done anything approaching this level of project. So just let me say, if I'm not speaking from a point of expertise here. However, I have worked on much smaller projects where I've been the writer and producer and not the director, because that's not my talent set. I have directed audiobooks, but that's a very different thing because it's not visual. You're just trying to get the audio to happen. And what I love about what you guys are talking about is this sense of trust in collaboration that Caleb, you can rely upon Drew, and Drew can rely upon you to fulfill the roles that each of you has been signed up for. I just think that that's really phenomenal, because whenever I've put a team together, whether it's to work on an audiobook or whether it's to work on a short film or whatever, that has been sort of like the essential piece of collaboration, right? If I don't trust the person over that's gonna operate with me, then what are we doing? So I actually love your Mexican restaurant margaritas meetings. Drew, I love that, because that's where this stuff can come together and people can say, yeah, I can rely upon this person. This person's going to do the best job that they can do for me, and I'm going to do the best job I can do for them, and it's going to be a relationship that's really powerful. So thank you guys for doing that and for putting out this film. I have one more question for you, and that is, the Mongolian Connection now exists. Congratulations to you guys. It now exists in the universe as a piece of art. And as this piece of art that's available to literally millions of people, because it's on Amazon Prime right now, at least at the time of this recording, it's on Amazon Prime. So hopefully, even if it's on Amazon, you can still buy it. But right now it's free on Amazon Prime. That's really, really powerful. And so I want to let Drew have the last word on this as the writer-director of this film. So I'll turn to you, Caleb, first. But as a storyteller, for both of you, as a storytellers, what do you want people to take away, given your experience with this particular story, even if they only listen to our conversation, but especially if they go out and watch it themselves? So Caleb, I'll start with you, and then Drew, you get the last word on your film.
Yeah, so I have one main answer and then two smaller ones, but I wanted to have a really impressive, thought-provoking answer here. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how relatively simple my answer was. And if it came out in a different year, maybe my answer would be a little bit different. But mostly, I want people to just be able to escape for 90 minutes. And I don't mean escape in a negative way, which is how it often gets used. I mean in a positive way. J.R. Tolkien, he wrote, "I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is so often used. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls?" And I looked up when Tolkien wrote that. It was 1939. It was the year World War II started. And then this year, another great fantasist, Christine Catherine Rush, I read something of hers, and she said, I see a lot of writers. I know a lot of writers seeing the suffering and death all around us, think that the work they do isn't worthwhile, but it is, because the human species needs to relax. We make better decisions when we're not stressed, when we have a chance to escape our world for a little while, not just in restless sleep, but through our imaginations. And so I think that's really the main thing that I want, is people to be able to have that experience, to not be talking about jailers and prison walls, to be able to relax and escape into their imaginations, and not into just sort of like some forced not paying attention, And related to that, just the two minor things. One is just fun. I want people to have fun, and I want people to laugh. The film has a strong comedic streak, so part of what you're trying to do is just give people an enjoyable experience. And then lastly, I'll just say, I really hope that people walk away with a greater appreciation for Central Asia in general, and Mongolia in particular, which is a very rich, storied, dynamic culture. It's one of the most influential cultures in human history. But when you see Mongolia depicted in film, if at all, it's usually just depicted as like the military rival of China somewhere between the 12 and 1600s. And there's a lot more to Mongolia than that. And so I hope that it at least makes people curious, or just broadens their understanding of what Central Asia and Mongolia is like.
By the way, before you go, Drew, I just have to say my favorite running joke throughout the whole movie is whenever Wade gets in a car in Mongolia. That's my favorite running joke, and his reaction to that is really, really good. So congratulations on that too. So yeah, what about you, Drew?
Well, so I mean, whenever asked, which I'm rarely asked, but whenever asked to describe what kind of films I want to make, I say art house meets grindhouse. I love genre conventions, particularly American genre conventions. But I don't like hollow entertainment. I don't like crass commercial entertainment that feels like pandering. I don't think the audience does either. I think it's rare that you'd find audience that would stick up for a film that doesn't have real thought put into it. Now, make no mistake, The Mongolian Connection is a low-budget, independent action film with I think but comedic element, and I hope some truth to it. But so it is designed to entertain. But I really believe that all the difficulty, all the time spent, all the conversations that Caleb and I had, the times that Caleb had to stay up late into the night in Los Angeles so that he could get me a rewrite of a scene or a totally restructured scene so that it would be waiting for me early morning in Mongolia. All that time, all those times, the audience knows it's there. The audience knows when a film has been sort of crassly thrown together with simple commercial intentions. And so even though we've talked a lot today about stuff that Caleb and I hope to make into the film, and some of which didn't, even though it sort of goes back to what Caleb was saying, sometimes just the essence of the fact that much thought was put into characters, that much thought was given to even a character, who otherwise would just be a two-dimensional bad guy. The fact that there's a certain gleam in his or her eye, a character's eye, that a certain swagger, even the way those details that end up on the cutting room floor has informed the performance of an actor, because that actor, when performing, doesn't know that a scene that they care about isn't going to make the final cut. It will inform their character throughout. So I guess as far as the audience, first of all, especially right now, this is the past several years, perhaps the past decade, has been an increasingly difficult time for independent feature film. The world really is in a place now where there is amazing scripted streaming content, longer form, 10 hours, stuff like True Detective, and 1,000 other shows that are amazing. But the feature world has been drained from a lot of its potency as far as storytelling and reaching a bigger market. So I hope that, like Caleb's saying, that the audience that watches the film enjoys it because it's something really unique. It really is, I think it's safe to say, the only film of its type right now. It'll give a glimpse into a culture that most of us, myself included, until I started this process, knows very little about. We all know, who Genghis Khan is, but we don't necessarily know anything about modern day Mongolia, about Ulaanbaatar, about what a district of formerly nomadic people settling into the hills over a Soviet-built city, what that looks like. So I hope that the audience is entertained, the audience gets some thrills from the action, that enjoys the characters, has some good laughs, learns something maybe a little bit about a culture that they may not know much about. But I guess for me, what I always hope to create for the audience is some intrigue. And hopefully, because it's a glimpse into a culture that many Westerners may know very little about, and we very, very intentionally wrote a fish out of water character, an American, who goes, and we allow him to bungle around a bit and to make some mistakes, while earnestly trying to understand and to be, even if only briefly, a good force, while being a guest in this culture. So long answer to a short question, but yeah, I guess that's where I'd like the audience to be. I hope that they enjoy it, have fun for 90 minutes, and come away having, maybe picked up a little bit about a culture they don't know much about.
Yeah, that's awesome. And let me give you one more compliment for this film that I think is really important, and it speaks to your experience, Drew, investing your time and a lot of your effort into understanding the culture. This does not feel, I have not seen The Great Wall with Matt Damon in it, right? I have not seen that film, but just the trailer alone is like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, there's a Westerner who comes in and it just like saves the day. It's almost like The Last Samurai or whatever, right? I want to give you guys a huge compliment with this film, that it does not feel like that at all. This is not a Western character who comes in and saves an Eastern culture from itself. This is more, as you just described it, a fish out of water who goes, I'm just going to do what I can to help in the context that I can help in. And so I think that it feels very much like a love letter to Mongolia, a place that does have all of these problems, but that you want to showcase as a place that is worth our attention. And I think that that's really, really cool. And I really enjoyed that part of it. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Drew, where can people find more about what you're working on, what you do? Tell the folks a little bit how they can find some of the stuff that you're up to.
Well, so the Mongolian Connection is available on Amazon. It's also now on iTunes. It's on Blu-ray. You can order it on Blu-ray. Though I guess, and I could get myself in trouble for saying this, I like the audio mix on the streaming version better. Oh, that's such a filmmaker thing to say. I'm sorry, but yeah, watch it on a good TV. Turn it up loud, as far as my previous film, well, I've got two previous films. My original film was simply called Coachella. It's the first feature-length documentary about Coachella. There's only two. One came out this year. Mine came out in 2006. And so if you're a music lover, if you've ever been to Coachella, if you've ever wanted to go to Coachella, there's that. You can find that on Amazon as well and on iTunes. My second film called Channeling was by the distributor. Well, they wanted a more genre title for it. They asked me to come up with something because all their ideas were lousy. And I came up with Bloodshot because it deals with the human eye. It's a film that came out before Black Mirror, and though it's often compared to Black Mirror because it's sort of high concept sci-fi, speculative sci-fi, and sort of a dark, sort of a jaundiced view of social media. But I'm also quite proud of that film. It is on Amazon under the name Bloodshot, spelled as two words. It's a little bit, they've sort of buried it because there's some rights disputes going on right now, which unfortunately is also the reality of independent film. We had a less than ethical distributor for the United States and actually other parts of the world as well. So that's an ongoing thing, but both those, all three of those films are now available. Heck, if you enjoy them, find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is yayforstuff. Or you can just type in my name, come find me, say, hey, Drew, I watched your film and I really dug it. If you hate the film, don't tell me that. Don't do that.
Come fight me for that. You can find Drew if you loved it.
If you hate the film, go tell Caleb, and Caleb will protect me from your opinions. But no, I do think people will enjoy this film. I don't think it's some people find low budget movies a little bit challenging. Some people it's really a fun. I think it's a fun ride that I think will not feel like you've eaten fast food at the end, even though you've enjoyed eating it while you eat it.
Absolutely. That's great. That's phenomenal. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. That was a fantastic conversation. And that is it for today's show. So special thanks to Caleb Monroe and Drew Thomas for joining me. If you like this conversation, hit that like button for us. And if you've got a comment or a question, leave it in the comments down below. If you're listening on audio, just shoot us an email and we can answer any of your questions. Remember, the Impactful Writing Podcast will be on the Story Geeks podcast channel starting on January of 2021. So you can catch the audio version there. And our recording time is changing. Starting in January, Caleb and I, because Caleb and I will not be in the same time zone, we will be recording live shows every other Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. If there's a storytelling or writing topic you'd like for us to cover, please let us know, and make sure you're subscribed on YouTube or your preferred podcast provider so you don't miss the next conversation. Please go check out their film, The Mongolian Connection. It's on Amazon, easy to get to, on iTunes as well. So please go check that out. Keep writing, keep improving, and we will see you on the next show. Thanks again, guys.
Thanks, guys.